Before this whole YouTube thing, when I still worked in tech, I worked at a company where we had a chat app that was essentially responsible for taking a message that was sent to our customer service, understanding its intent, and doing an action based on what the chatbot thought that the customer wanted. The app was built before GPT and modern chatbots became as powerful as they are now. So the way the app understood the intent of the customer was by running a huge list of these hard-coded rules that we programmed it to follow. If a message contains this word, do this action. If a message contains this word, do this action. And there was some other more complicated logic, but that was basically the idea. The company had a lot of things to build, so we never had time to fix bugs. And as you could imagine, the complaints about the chatbot started to really pile up. One of the classic problems was the word return. If somebody used the word return, the system would almost always interpret that as somebody wanting to return a product. And if the system thought that was your intent, it would send you a prepaid shipping label and open a return case. It didn't matter what you actually wanted. You could have asked, did this product return to stock? Or you could have said, I'd like to return to a previous question. One person wrote, I'd like to return as a customer once this is resolved. And they were sent a confirmation that their return case was initiated. This type of hard-coded logic is what a lot of companies did to offer automatic support, because at that time, there just wasn't a lot of readily available great alternatives. And if all you have access to is this rule-based logic, of course you're going to end up with complaints. You're going to create a fundamental design issue. You can't anticipate every single thing a human might say and write a rule for it. Language doesn't work that way. Humans are too inconsistent, too ambiguous, and too context-dependent for a list of rules to be able to figure out what they're trying to say. And this is what pops into my head every time someone says they're going to try to learn a language studying grammar. What's going on, guys? My name's Nick, and before I founded Lengualytics and before I became fluent in Spanish, I worked in tech. I've worked at or with more than 10 different consulting firms on tons and tons of code bases. If you live in the United States, there's a high chance that you've used a website that I've had some part in creating. And 6 years of being a tech workaholic has basically rewired how I think. Not just about software, but basically about every single thing in my life. In fact, I often wake up in the middle of the night having fever dreams that I'm coding. That is true. They're not fun. So anyway, when I started learning Spanish, I came to it with this same kind of systems mindset. And my first instinct as someone who thinks in systems was to treat Spanish like a kind of rule-based program. In the beginning, this seems completely logical because languages just seem like our native language with different rules and different words. So if you buy a language learning textbook, you can kind of treat that as the documentation that teaches you how to use the new language. The problem is that's exactly the same mistake we made with that crude customer service chatbot. You can't write a list of rules to cover a living language. It's just too large, it's too complex, there's too much irregularities, there's too much regional slang, and there's tons of idioms that literally don't even make grammatical sense in the language. The textbook version of Spanish and the actual Spanish you're gonna hear on the streets are two completely different things. So if the rule-based paradigm is wrong, then what's the correct paradigm? And this is where my background in software really helped me because I already saw the answer. The answer is machine learning. Machine learning throws out the idea of hard coding rules. You don't tell the machine the rules of a language, you just give it a ton of data in that language and the machine figures out the patterns on its own. The model builds its own internal representations of how words relate to each other, what phrases usually come after other phrases, what sounds natural and what sounds unnatural. And this allows the model to generalize. It allows the model to handle cases that nobody anticipated. Because it didn't learn from a set of rules, it learned from massive exposure. And that's what comprehensible input is. Every hour you spend genuinely listening to the language at a level you understand, that's like you doing a training run. Your brain is doing exactly what it was built to do, extracting patterns from data, building intuitions, and updating its internal model of the language. And it's important to mention that modern language learning models use algorithms called neural networks. And neural networks are called neural networks because originally they were based on how the human brain works. So the similarities between the human brain and machine learning algorithms It's not an accident. And here's where it gets interesting, because the machine learning comparison doesn't just explain why CI works. It also explains several things about language learning that might seem unintuitive when you start. The first thing is garbage in, garbage out. In machine learning, a model always trains on outside input. It never trains on its own produced output. For instance, OpenAI would never knowingly train ChatGPT on output that ChatGPT created. And the reason for that is you just reinforce whatever inaccuracies are already in the system. If AI trained on AI slop, you would just create worse AI slop. Or in more technical terms, the signal would degrade over time. And that's a great analogy for why I don't think speaking the language actually helps you acquire the language. When you speak a language, you're executing the system that your brain has already built. So you're not feeding it anything new, and worse off, you're feeding it your output, which is always going to be of a lower quality than the input you received from a native speaker. You're always going to speak a foreign language in a bit of a broken way, no matter how many hours you put into the language. The second thing is interesting as well, and it has a name in modern AI research. It's called the black box problem. A black box is a function or a system where you can see the inputs and you can see the outputs, but you have no visibility of what's going on inside that function or system. The knowledge in a neural network is distributed across millions of parameters that aren't human readable. So it's not like you could open up ChatGPT and see its decision tree and see all of the decisions it's making, which means for all intents and purposes, its decision-making system is implicit, just like the human mind. Ask any native speaker why a sentence sounds wrong, and they'll always say,
I don't know, it just sounds wrong.
Because as native speakers, we don't really have access to a list of grammar rules in our heads. We can only access those grammar rules at an intuitive level. Our mind is simply a black box that took in thousands or tens of thousands of hours of input and came out on the other side knowing what sounds correct and incorrect in the language. The third thing is overfitting. In machine learning, overfitting is when a model performs great on its training data but falls apart when you give it something new. It memorized the examples instead of learning the underlying pattern. It optimized for a test as opposed to optimizing for the real world. And this is a great analogy to learning a language using highly curated sentences and language learning apps, as opposed to going out in the wild and experiencing how true native speakers speak. When you train yourself on textbook examples, you get really good at understanding textbook examples, but you fall apart when you watch authentic native content. And when I say authentic native content, I don't mean the news in another language or movies in another language. I mean any authentic native speaker communicating with you, because your understanding of the language will be so curated and so fake that when you actually meet a real native speaker or watch a beginner comprehensible input video, you're just going to feel lost because you're not used to how actual native speakers speak their own language at any level. Just like a machine learning algorithm, you overfitted on inauthentic content that sounds robotic and doesn't translate to how Spanish or German or Chinese really sounds at a street level. You need a wide variety of authentic content in your target language so you can exist in authentic context, because people in the streets or people you meet in real life or even people you watch on YouTube are not going to speak a textbook version of the language you're learning. This is a big part of why I'm so bought into the comprehensible input method. I don't believe in it because it was proven by some scientific study I never read. I believe in it because I've seen it work. You and I, over the last 3 years, have basically watched machines learn human language through this exact same basic process. Feed a model enough real data in context, and it develops the ability to produce and understand the language naturally, without ever being explicitly taught a rule. That's not a coincidence. That's the comprehensible input method working for machines. Whenever you study grammar, you're doing that hard coding I was talking about at the beginning of the video. You're trying to manually write rules for something that's too complex to be captured that way. And I'm not saying it can't help, especially in the short term, but it's not what builds the system. You want to get to the point that when someone's speaking incorrectly, you can just feel it. You don't know exactly why, you can't say the rule, but you just know in your guts what they're saying sounds weird. and you'll never get there by memorizing a list of grammar rules and direct translations. If you like the framing of this video and you want to understand language learning more from my perspective, I recommend you click this video right here. And another shout out real quick, I did start a second YouTube channel for non-native English speakers to help you guys learn English through gaming, through a Fire Red Let's Play. I'm gonna leave the link to the first video in the series in the description. Thanks for watching.